All right, let's dive in. So basically my goals for this session are to pretty much try and educate you on the habitual loop itself, show where it's being used and how effectively it's often used, the pros and cons of that, so the good and evil in addiction. So many people can often think of the negatives of addiction, but there are some goods there as well. Some of the long-term effects and some of the legal factors that have started to come in over the years. And at the end, answer any questions you may also have still regarding this. But to start with, how or why should you trust me, and how do I know what I'm talking about? So to begin with, my original background is I have a background in games design and development. So a bit of background in coding, 3D design, audio design, level design, all that sort of thing. And that's from Deakin University. And that was a while ago now, but obviously while I was there, and you start learning that getting into games, especially in Australia at that time, was definitely much trickier. So obviously learned a variety of skills and decided, all right, well, we'll take a lot of these skills and sort of get into that career in a sideways fashion rather than digging straight into a games sort of career. So then I left Deakin and got a job at Appster. So when I was hired there, I was one of the initial hires there originally, and obviously my major focus was around any of the games that came in. I'd obviously take a lot of ownership of them and make sure that we built those the right way. And through my time at Appster, I've learned a lot of other additional skills around team leadership and that sort of thing. And then eventually came across to DiUS, which I've been a part of for, I believe, about 4 years now. And while here, I also still enjoyed interacting in the gamer sig. Outside of DiUS, I also do a lot of extracurriculars with educational groups. So I do presentations for UNSW, a few of the other Melbourne unis, and a couple of the Victorian high schools. I have an extracurricular program with them that we actually design iPhone and Android games for the high schoolers and get them into the sort of STEM side of things. But that's a bit of my background. And in terms of gaming and addiction, I've got plenty of expertise in that as well, which I can touch on a bit later. All right, so in terms of the topic itself, which is habitual dependence. So basically, habitual dependence you'll see is in the center here around the activation side of things. Now, this whole journey is called pirate metrics. And I often give a chance for anyone to yell out why, but it's one of the most annoying things. They're called pirate metrics, is because it's acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and referral, which stands for R, which is why they're known as pirate metrics. Today, we'll obviously be looking at really around the activation or the dependence side of things. And to give context for it, acquisition is often trying to get someone into a product. Then once you have them, you have to get them to activate or engage with it and build up that dependence, which we'll go into. Retain them, which is also that churn and how quickly they leave. Once they do that, you can often make revenue from them. And depending across that whole journey, you'll often have points of referral or virality. So getting your customers to bring others in and keep spreading it along that journey. But today I really want to go into, okay, once we're in there, how do they keep us coming back? Why do we have to keep coming back to Facebook? Or why do we have to keep coming back to Candy Crush, whatever it might be? So where's it used? Pretty much already touched on some major ones, but pretty much everywhere. After today, hopefully I've often had cases of people messaging me after the presentation and that sort of thing, basically telling me how they see it everywhere now. You'll see it's built into almost everything you interact with, whether it's physical products like McDonald's, which you can see with the Monopoly example on the left, which is an obvious major one that lots of people get around. Facebook itself, or even going back to as classic as baseball cards, which is probably one of the first examples of where they started to really build this in. So what is it? Basically, habitual dependence, if we're talking about the scientific term, originally sort of came around in the early 1900s with the Skinner box, which some of you may have heard of back in high school or just through general reading, which was really the time of those sort of psychological experiments before a lot of ethics and such came in, which meant that they could sort of push the limits in a lot of areas which we wouldn't do these days as much, but did find some interesting responses. So in this case, with Skinner, basically he wanted to find out what would happen if had some mice or rats in some cages and a button to press to get some food. When they pressed the button, either food would come out and a noise would start, or it wouldn't. And basically, you want to put them through this scenario of getting them to press the button Food comes out, next time it doesn't, next time it does, and see how the rat's reacted. Now, in this initial scenario, sorry, which you can see on the left here, is that fixed ratio. They just press it every second time some cheese or food comes out. Now, they found with this scenario that not much changes. It's basically the rat would just stop once it got full. However, when he changed the experiment up a bit and changed it to a variable scenario, so still on average, every second time food would come out, but now it was randomized. So as you can see with the example on the right, 2 times there was none, and 2 times there was, then there wasn't, then there was. And there was a large change in how the rat and then mice reacted. So basically they started coming back, and instead of just stopping when they got full, they kept going, and literally in some cases kept eating until they made themselves sick. So something about that change in the random interval made them get almost addicted and keep coming back for more of those hits to see if they got the cheese. Now, you're probably already thinking of some classic examples where this could come in, but we'll touch on why this happened a little bit later and show a couple of examples of where this loop starts happening and why the rat starts getting into this sort of mental acuity. So to start with, in this first loop, is the trigger. Now, if the trigger for the rat in this circumstance, there's always 2 triggers. There's internal or external triggers. Internal triggers are probably obvious to you. They're things like you're bored, or in the rat's case, it's hungry. It's literally just a trigger, like your stomach telling you, yeah, you want some food. So that's an easy one. These are just things to remind you of, oh, I want this for some particular reason. While external triggers these days are a lot more obvious and become a lot more in our face due to lots of the companies and such. But these can range from notifications, such as I know, like a great example actually is my partner. She's one of the types that cannot have a notification sitting on her email thing. She has to open it and get rid of it, which is an excellent external one. Well, I can sit there with the 99 plus on like my spam email. That doesn't bother me. Other ones obviously is advertisements. Billboards, this could be TV ads, anything that basically is something external advertising to you, something you might want. And then lastly, a very common and strong one is actually the external influence of just recommendations or talking to people or friends. Again, the amount of times people will say that the recommendations or referrals is what really gets them to look at something or try something. So first off, you get that trigger. That makes you start thinking about whatever this may be. Then we move into what we call the routine. And I'll go through the full journey after I touch on each of the pieces so you see how they work together. So the routine is now, okay, you've been reminded that you're hungry or you want to check out something or whatever it may be. The routine is pretty much arguably the boring part. This is the part where you go in and you almost go into autopilot for a bit. It's just the browsing or doing the action to get to the reward. So in the circumstance of Apple over here or using Instagram, that could be a situation of basically Instagram and Facebook. The amount of times that I've known people, or even myself at stages, to basically just in a default scenario, oh, I'm standing there for 2 seconds not doing anything, I'll tap on Facebook or Instagram and start scrolling. You don't even think as to why or that you are. It's just become a routine that you instantly just start going into it and start scrolling. Your brain almost basically goes to autopilot. This is the same for perhaps possibly looking at one of my favorite things is I'm a big music fan. So looking at Spotify, and every week they come up with a collection of music based on what you've been listening to that could be interesting. That gets me excited. So I'm always keen to go through that list. Or even these days, a very common one with us all in lockdown is Netflix or anything that's possibly video streaming where you basically finished your TV series or finished your movies. So what do you do next? Go into the browse and just start scrolling through the movies or TV shows and see what's there. So that's that routine where it's the boring part, you almost go into autopilot. It's something you don't really think of. And for a routine to work, you have to have the motivation and the ability to do it. Now, the reason that's important, and this is for certain products, is basically the stronger your motivation, the more you are willing to put more effort into actually doing it. So even if the ease is really low, or in this case, like the motivation is really high, but it's really hard to do something, you will push through because you want to get that result. While if it's something like, maybe something like Facebook, where maybe your actual motivation is quite low, but if it wasn't as easy as it is to do it, you wouldn't bother. But because it's so easy just to tap the app and start scrolling, you don't even think about it. So in terms of the triggers that actually get you to do something or get you into that routine, it will often come down to the person's motivation about like, is this for hunger? You're going to be trying a lot more if you're starving than if you're just got like a grumble in your stomach, and the ability. So do you have to make a full feast or can you just grab a snack from the cupboard? And maybe this actually starts to show reasons as to why junk food is a lot more popular than going and putting the motivation and effort into making something healthy, because the ability to get that junk food and the triggers for it are so much easier than the motivation to actually do something healthy and prepare a full meal. That's where the routine comes in. So, okay, you've gone through the journey, you've done sort of the boring part. So what you're trying to get to is the reward. Now, generally, rewards can be broken down in many, many different ways. This is just one of the general scenarios that are broken into 3 areas, and often they will overlap. But a reward is often broken down into the tribe, the self, and the hunt. So in terms of the tribe, and this obviously ties back to a lot of our older generations and a lot of our biological history and evolution. So the tribe is a reward that's something that sort of benefits you as a group or as a community. So in these days, you could often maybe consider that relationships and social side of things are actually benefiting yourself, and on a larger scale, that progression of the tribe. There can be many other examples to that. So lots of people that say, put lots of effort into public measures that help people on a large scale or that sort of thing. So that sort of reward for the tribe and moving forward as a group. There's the self, which is pretty straightforward. This is skills for your individual self. So this could be, as it shows for today, musicianship skills. This could be anything that sort of really individually is you're doing it for you. It's not really for the group per se, or any sort of material outcome often. It's just for something that is to reward the self and improve oneself. And then the hunt often overlap into both. But the hunt is obviously more an actual materialistic reward that can be used for either a group or the self. So obviously in ancient times we've been hunting literally and bringing that back. And these days, obviously the hunt is usually around either societal things like trying to find a relationship, or it could be around monetary. So obviously these days, a lot of the hunt is focused on getting money, and that is the hunt for lots of individuals. And you can see where that could possibly be abused when it comes to, say, gambling or that sort of thing, trying to make that ability and ease quite low and the routine quite quick and so on. But again, we'll get into how that gets you addicted. So you're after this reward for either the tribe, yourself, or the hunt scenario. So then why did this start triggering certain effects? Well, basically, we started to find, and obviously as we move further in history, with further forward, we've started to find that obviously the reactions of the dopamine levels in the brain is a large part of it. And we found that in normal scenarios, say you weren't built into this routine reward sort of loop, your dopamine levels are sort of going up and down as they sort of should with different scenarios. And then you get to the reward, so in this case, the chocolate, and you get a bigger spike. So it's like, yeah, cool. You get your happy go spike. And if those who don't know dopamine, it's basically that happiness level you feel. It's the chemical that gives you that happiness feel. But once we started moving into this routine reward sort of loop and actually making it more variable, what started to happen was you get the trigger, so you get the dopamine spike of, yes, I want to get, might be money reward, whatever it might be. We'll use the Facebook example, so it might be something like, yes, I've got a notification of a message or something. Then you go into routine. So basically we started to find the brain almost goes on autopilot. You don't even think about what you're doing pretty much. It's basically on that routine level until you get that reward where it gets another big spike of dopamine. So it started to cause a chemical effect in the brain that you actually like this loop because you're getting these big spikes of dopamine rather than the sort of that constant level. And then obviously, once you have those spikes in the dopamine and that sort of stuff, you like this product, whatever it is, but why do you come back? Why don't you just okay, well, I've got those effects from there. Now I'll go do something else and I'll get my dopamine spikes, or basically I will go do something else to feel enjoyment somewhere else. Why do you come back to Facebook? Why do you come back to Instagram or Spotify or Candy Crush or anything like that? So the reason you come back is investment. So this is the idea that pretty much, and you'll see this everywhere once you've seen it, is basically the idea that you can't leave because of, well, in Instagram's case, I'll lose all my followers. So I can't join another platform now because I'll lose all my followers, all my posts and my history, or all of that side of things. Or I can't leave Apple Music and join Spotify, or I can't leave Spotify and join Apple Music because I've got my playlist of over 1,000 songs and this sort of thing. It's that age-old war. And this is where lots of, say, the Apple and Android wars will come, because they'll be fighting over one is better than the other. But really what the argument is coming down to is they're so invested in their product now that it would take so much effort for them to go to the other that they'd rather just defend it than actually look at what is possibly better for them. And it's the same in terms of LinkedIn with your connections. Why would we not join another social work platform? Or even in terms of products, pop figurines and that sort of thing. Like, why do you keep buying more? Why don't you try collecting the next big thing? Because I've already got 100 of these things on the side. So it's that investment that keeps you coming back. And in the worst circumstances, which you would have seen in this, is investment returns, which is basically the worst circumstances. You build it up, and then if you don't come back, it gets taken away from you. Now, this has become a bit less common these days, but everyone would have remembered it in Farmville or that sort of thing on Facebook. But basically, it was the idea that you've put so much effort into it and got all these rewards for it, and now if you don't come back, it all just disappears and goes. So that is like a horrible feeling. It's almost a negative reinforcement to come back, which is why it's a bit less used these days, because people started to twig onto it a bit more. So to recap the actual loop itself, the idea is that you're triggered by something. So we'll use the Facebook scenario. Basically, you've got an internal trigger or external trigger. In Facebook's case, an internal trigger might just be, oh, I'm bored, I want to see what's happening, or fear of missing out, if it's like a popular event. An external trigger would be obviously a notification from Facebook, say, hey, you've got a message. Your action would be then to go in and actually start scrolling through the messages, see what's there, see the list of things. And the ability is obviously how easy it is to do that. Facebook, so easy to do it. That's kind of the point. So make it really easy. You're in there, you start scrolling through. Now, the reward when it comes to a Facebook notification or anything on that side may be around, it could be like, again, that fear of missing out element. So an event you didn't know was coming up becomes like a big reward. It's like, oh, yes, that's really cool. Or you get to be part of something that is like a limited experience, like someone's birthday or something like that. Or you get to be, say, part of something that is quite limited. So a fans only thing for a band you like or something like that, where they're having a fans only concert and you get to see part of that. That reward is that big spike. And it's like, yes, there's a reason that I'm on Facebook, even though half the time it's boring, you get that big spike. And that trigger or the commitment, and this is where investments are often the trickiest but most important part, is a good investment will lead to another trigger. So say we've gone with that scenario that you've seen this event for a band you really like, and it's only for those fans that saw it. You sign up for it, you're like, yes, that's your reward. Now your commitment or your next trigger is you now get a notification from Facebook when the event is coming up, or you can't leave Facebook because it's got all your events there. So then the event comes up, you get a trigger. Ah, yes, that's right, the concert's coming up. Jump in, see the stuff that everyone's posting, get a good idea of what's coming up. Maybe that's your reward. It's posted to someone else, and this loop continues. So you sort of see now how every part is necessary, but the investments are often the things that will bring you back to that particular product. So you can get addicted to something, or you can enjoy something, but not return because you can get that same enjoyment elsewhere. But that investment will draw you back to make you think you have to come back to this product. And a really good investment will trigger the next internal, external trigger to make you come back in again for something else and continue down that loop. So hopefully it gives a bit of an idea of how products are sort of doing this bit of a circle. And my favorite example of this, quickly for the parents out there, is McDonald's. And the reason I love this is because we'll look at it through a kid's eyes, is basically the trigger for McDonald's might be something like, oh, an ad pops up during a kid's cartoon show. The action for them is like, oh, come on, we want to go to Macca's, get this new toy, whatever it might be. So the routine is actually for them is eating the food. That's not the reward. The reward comes in to be one of those, oh, now you've got the new Batman toy or whatever it might be. And then the investment, which is the really smart part with McDonald's, is, oh, but that Batman toy is one part of a Justice League set. There's another 3 or 4 you need to collect, which is a different time, which becomes that variable reward about, oh, which one am I going to get? So then that toy becomes the trigger of like, oh, wait, I need to get the other ones to go back to Macca's to get the next, try and get the next toy and see which one you get, which is the next trigger, and so on, which is why Macca's is very strong when it comes to kids' motivations around to come in and keep getting the next toys in the parks and that sort of thing. They're brilliant at that sort of stuff. So we get an idea of how it's working. And I've already touched a little bit on those bad use cases. So some of the scenarios where that gets used can be abused quite heavily too. So a good example here, we'll actually touch on the image on the right first, which is the breakdown of how often players are seen in, often it's probably started with mobile games, but now has spread to console games, pretty much anything, and many other products as well. And that came through the idea of microtransactions. So these are little transactions rather than buying a game for, say, $60 or $100, and you don't have to spend anything else. This is the idea of getting something for free, and then there's options to spend, say, $1 or $2 in there. So the general breakdown of players in these scenarios is that 45% of people generally won't spend much, if anything. So they're literally like just playing it for free, want to try it out. If it gets to the point of making them spend money, they'll drop off. It doesn't really bother them. Roughly half, or 49% of players, will spend roughly $1 to $10 a month in a particular game that they're playing, which is still reasonable. That's not like an over addiction or that sort of thing. If you're spending $10 a month on something you spend a few hours with every month, it's probably a good investment to return for enjoyment. But the problem comes in is most game companies will target these players, which are known as the whales to them, or the heavy players. These are players which arguably have hit that addiction limit and will spend greater than $10 a month, and in some cases, much, much more. So there is lots of articles with, and we'll use EA as an example, but many examples of FIFA, if you've heard of the FIFA games, are quite bad for microtransactions and abusing young players to even older players. And in some cases, in one circumstance, I don't have the article here, unfortunately, but a player coming back and reporting they'd spent $9,000 in 1 month on microtransactions. And the way it worked is because of that loop. It built in this loop that like every time you open up this pack in FIFA to get some players, there is a random chance about which players you get. And so that loop, and then the investment comes back in that this is a really big thing online on YouTube and streaming. So people are watching this all the time. They want to get those players. So in fact, that watching other people do it and that sort of stuff becomes a bit of a trigger or investment in itself. And you keep going through this loop. And people don't realize that I'm only spending $5 to open a card pack or something. But then when you do this every day, or you do this a couple of times a day and you're not twigging because it's like, oh, it's $5, it's like a cup of coffee. But when you're not keeping track of that, it grows and grows. And the best example of this you can see on the left here is EA. So notorious within the gaming community for being a terrible company when it comes to monetizing players and trying to get the most out of every player they can. You'll see actually this has changed dramatically over the last decade, but the graph here is made to be showing that the blue section is for full game downloads. So that's basically you're paying $100 for a game, that's it. Don't have to spend anything else. And the yellow is mobile, so obviously mobile games. But then the green is live services, which as you can see is majority of their intake. And live services are microtransactions. So the fact that EA is now making 27% of their entire revenue through microtransactions and basically abusing this heavy player whale base is quite concerning. And that's where a lot of the negative effects come in. And that's the bad use case of sort of trying to use that loop and get more and more money out of an individual person. So if that's the case, how can this be seen as something good, or how can it be used as a good scenario? Well, there is some examples of this where you can use the same principle and do it for something good. And again, it sort of ties back to that idea that no matter what we make when it comes to technology or that sort of thing in the future, it can always be used for good or evil, but really it's up to us as to how it gets used. And some of the examples of this, obviously there's those water drink reminders, which literally try to make, or even exercise apps, which try to make it a game to incentivize the user to keep doing exercise, or triggering certain those triggers for the external internal triggers, doing the routine, getting a reward of seeing you've drunk more or you've worked off more calories, and even sometimes tying that back to monetary rewards. So there are some health insurance companies which will now reward you with like monetary rewards for doing monthly exercise or losing a certain amount of weight or that sort of thing. And then another excellent example, I think, of where addiction was used quite effectively and in a somewhat positive way was Pokemon Go. So that was one that obviously everyone knows Pokemon. It's very easy to get addicted to because of that investment. Hundreds of Pokemon you can get, but you have to catch every one. It's got to catch them all. That already shows you how that loop is deliberately building in there. But this was getting you to go outside, go walking. I believe even Michelle Obama talked about how this was one of her favorite apps to come out because it actually got people exercising in a fun, healthy way. Obviously, there are some negatives to this, as I believe in the year it came out, there were more deaths from Pokemon Go than there were from like natural deaths in terms of shark attacks or animal attacks. So there is definitely negatives there if not controlled. But it is nonetheless showing that you can use that same loop of the dopamine and those sort of elements to actually incentivize exercise and improving yourself. So really, where does this fall? Like, are games good or bad for us? Is this loop good or bad for us? Well, touching on the legal and medical sides, the World Health Organization has sort of jumped in recently, especially as this has grown more and more. And in 2018, they actually put out a classification now saying that gaming disorder will now be defined as an actual disorder. It will be video game addiction disorder and will come into place in the year 2022. And the way they defined this was basically any pattern, and you can sort of see down the bottom here, the behavior pattern must be anywhere sufficient severity to result in impairment in their personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas that would normally have been evident for at least 12 months. So in a nutshell, basically saying you gamed so much that it makes a negative impact on the other areas of your life, which is still kind of broad. And is that inherently gaming itself, or is that like an addiction element, that sort of thing? But jump ahead 2 years to our current scenario of the COVID pandemic. We're all locked inside, and that can have large mental health effect issues. Interestingly, the World Health Organization, the same person who came out with that gaming disorder, Ray Chambers, recently released a statement saying gaming has the chance to reach millions with important messages to help them prevent the spread of COVID-19 and encourage players to maintain distance, as well as good practice hygienes like hand washing, and tweeted the post #PlayApartTogether in March 28 to sort of encourage that support of getting into gaming during this time. So it's kind of tricky to say, is it good or is it not? And even today, doing general searches and that sort of thing, like literally you do a general search for video game addiction, some of the top results will literally be like, nobody's properly talking about it. And then the next section will be like, oh, how it's actually quite good for your mental health, as there has been lots of studies around Alzheimer's and some other mental issues that can affect older age participants. And it actually been quite good for them, as it obviously helps with things like problem-solving skills, hand-eye coordination, lots of those sort of things. And then obviously further down, then it becomes video game addiction, becomes official mental disorder. How does it affect your mental health? And then depressed and anxious, these video games want to help you. So even now, it is still probably pretty evenly split between, is it good or bad? And really it comes down to us in terms of how we build this loop in. It's not inherently gaming, I feel, but often this loop that is built into products that is often seen as a gaming loop, but is really built into everything from McDonald's to Facebook to playing cards. So really, how can we use this in a positive manner? And then also, how do we sort of keep aware of it for those times when it's sort of being abused or trying to be used against us? And that's where I feel like learning through this is quite important. So overall, I try to give a recap on who I am and how I know what I'm talking about, why you should trust me when I'm talking about this stuff. Where does this fall into the full journey of a product? Really, this is around that addiction or trying to bring you back every day side things. Where is it used? And as we've seen, many of circumstances. How you can use it, so trying to use it for those positive circumstances, and starting to touch on some of those long-term effects, which admittedly are still up in the air, but nonetheless, we've started to get some studies coming in of showing positive and negative side effects. So we'll keep an eye on that as well. But it's always good to make sure you know what is happening to you and happening to the people around you. And that's about it from my side at this moment. So any questions?